Gracie Jiu Jitsu rocks. Welcome to the Gracie Jiu Jitsu Rocks podcast, a podcast dedicated to Gracie Jiu Jitsu and all things Gracie, including self-defense, competition, anti-bullying, women's self-defense and empowerment, nutrition, and most especially, the people involved in Gracie Jiu Jitsu. This podcast is for the average Joe. It's for anyone who practices, trains, teaches, or just loves to talk about or hear about Gracie Jiu Jitsu. We'll explore the lives of Gracie Jiu Jitsu practitioners, how they got involved in the art, and what effect it's had on their lives. So buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to episode 162 of the Gracie Jiu Jitsu Rocks podcast. As always, I'm your host, Marty Josie, and thanks for listening. Today, my guest will be Chris Haueter, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we do, let's start with our quote, and that is, "It is not about who's good, but who's left. It's time on the mat. You will be somewhere in 10 years. You might as well be a black belt too. Just don't quit." And that quote is from Chris Haueter, today's guest, and what a great quote it is. So Chris Haueter is a 6th degree black belt and an original member of the Dirty Dozen, and he's also founder of the Combat Base Jiu Jitsu. Chris was the first American to submit a Brazilian in competition, the first American to compete as a black belt at the Mundials in Brazil, and he continues to travel the world spreading his jiu-jitsu philosophy of think street, train sport, and practice art. He is also known for his golden rules of grappling and coining the term combat base as the base with one knee up and one knee down. So I had a really fun and interesting conversation with Chris, so I know you're going to enjoy this interview. After the interview, make sure you stick around for the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment. And now, without further ado, let's talk to Chris. All right, I'm speaking with the one and only Chris Haueter. So welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you taking the time. I've followed you for quite some time and been a fan of your work, so it's an honor for me. So thank you.
Well, thanks. The honor's mine. I'm always happy that anyone's interested in hearing me rant, because my wife doesn't want to hear me rant, right?
Has she heard enough of it, or what?
She's heard enough of me, yes.
Wives can be like that sometimes.
Yes, they can.
All right. Well, we are
they're
happy.
Good too. I have a good wife. She's a 3rd degree black belt, younger and tougher than me, so she keeps me on my toes.
All right. That sounds great. And I do want to ask you a little more about her in a few minutes. But let's start. I know you keep busy. I see you've been doing seminars lately. You've been working on your videos, and I think you just recently had your, monthly private with Master Rickson. So
yes.
Just kind of catch us up on those things. What's been going on with you recently?
Yeah, the last couple of years, other than during COVID, but I meet with Rickson usually once a month, sometimes once every other month, and it's wonderful. I love it. 8 years ago, when I turned 50, I'm 58 now, I was kind of in I don't know if you want to say an old age crisis with the jiu-jitsu, because for my youth, I had a much more youth-oriented games. I would even say not totally attribute-oriented, but I could invert, and I had a cardio for days, and that starts to go away when you're older. And Rickson has been a great mentor in helping to guide me through my continued growth in this art of jiu-jitsu.
Well, none better to learn from, right? For sure.
I certainly think so. Yes. I mean, maybe there's other equivalent or close to, but out of everybody who I've ever learned from, and I've learned from a lot of people, I really like Rickson's style teaching and coaching.
Yes, and our thoughts and prayers certainly go out to him for his recent diagnosis. I know if anybody's going to be a fighter in that, I know he is. So.
Absolutely. And, ironically, Rickson's pure warrior, and he looks at it as just another challenge.
Absolutely. And I relate to you when you say, your age, and I'm very similar in age, and sometimes going through, some challenges in or need for reassessment, if you will, in your game. So I like hearing that. I like hearing people that are older and still in the mat and still vibrant and doing well. And I'd always like to ask them, what's their secret for that, or what at least motivates them or keeps them on the mat.
Yeah, I often tell people, and one of the lines I'm kind of known for is it's not who's good, it's who's left.
Yes.
And as you get older, you start having to worry a little bit more about not getting hurt so you can be left. Yes. So like my goal for almost every role is first to not get hurt. And my second goal is first to cause no harm to my opponent. And by having that as the overall feel of your game, really not only keeps you from injuries, but it opens up such good growth pathways. My other thing that I'm kind of known for, at least amongst my own guys, is the way I've arranged the art of jiu-jitsu is in a triangle of you think street, you train the sport, and you practice the art. And that is the balance. And what is the art, you ask? I knew you would.
Sure.
The art is how do I control and submit my opponent in that order, utilizing the least amount of athletics and attributes and the maximum amount of leverage, knowledge, cunningness, and guile. That's the art. The sport is how do I deploy my art within the man-made rules of whatever game, whether it's MMA or grappling only, Chuck's backyard grapple off or IBJ, the JF. How do I deploy my art using all of my athletics? And that is the conflict between art and sport. And the think street is kind of the overarching spiritual essence of what we do, which keeps us honest. So the sport is practical. The art is exploratory and open. And the street is this kind of overarching nudge to remind us that this has to work in a real fight to the death, in essence.
Mm. So how do we, for those of us that are interested in keeping a street aspect, or at least a street philosophy or focus, how do we do that with going back to what you said, your number one rule is not to get hurt and not hurting others, which I love, by the way, because then it just opens up to just really having fun and taking the ego out and worrying about when
Yes.
you're.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a thing. I've always been kind of that way, even when I was young. I was never a kid who intended to hurt people, but I definitely rolled competitively. And I kind of have stopped that way of rolling, mostly because I want to keep rolling, but I have found it does open up for better learning pathways when you do release that need to feel like I got to win.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And that's a work in progress for me. 95% of the time I'm the same way, and I love being that way because it does open up such a richer experience for jiu-jitsu, in my opinion. And my number one is also to stay on the mat forever and, like you said, not get hurt. Because if you get hurt, nothing else matters. You're out, right? And hurting others, I'm not interested in that. But I do like, not being a slave to the ego. And there's a time for the ego, but it gets a bad rap, but not being a slave to the ego and keeping things fun. And like you said, it frees you up to experiment and enjoy the art side, which is great. And I do love that slogan or that motto, think street, train sport, practice art. I really think it covers all the areas and all the bases. I think a lot of jiu-jitsu has gotten to where it's kind of one or the other.
Yes.
And
yes.
And that's fine. You can do jiu-jitsu however you want, obviously, but I think keeping that encompassing broad view and practice of the art is wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I have found, like, I've been at this for over 30 years, and like anything, familiarity can breed a contempt, and we can get into a thing because we maybe do have more knowledge than most, that we can start getting too comfortable in our own knowledge, in our own shit. And you got to get out of your comfort zone when you want to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that, like, and I try to apply this in every area of my life. I try to recognize when I'm quick to judge something, to slow down and not. Even if it's something that maybe I have previously judged and concluded it sucks or whatever, I still, when it presents itself, try to look at it with as most open mind as I can and see if maybe I missed something the first time I judged it, right?
Absolutely. I think that comes with maturity, and that doesn't necessarily come with age, but when you mature, you're able to suspend that quick judgment, and maybe you even judged it, quickly in the past, but you can sit back and say, let me see if there is some merit to this, or let me see if I missed something the first time, or if it is something new. Let me just sit back and see what it's all about and see what merit it has before and I think when you're younger, you tend to kind of like, that's crap or whatever, and just go on, you know?
Yep.
So I really feel like that comes with maturity, and obviously you've come to that mature point where you, are seasoned and can suspend that quick judgment.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have any examples of other areas in your life where that has come into play specifically?
Well, I am an amateur, meaning I don't get paid for it, scientist, artist, and historian, although sometimes I get paid for my art. And as an avid philosophy fan, I always find that when you're asking questions, if the answer is more questions, I'm usually on the right path. If I think I have found the answer,
mm-hmm.
I'm closing my mind off to other possibilities. And so part of it is it's like almost what I would say, an active attempt to be humbly aware of how limited my knowledge is.
Wow.
And then through that, it lets me be, with all this, a student, in the true sense of I am going to, whatever topic it is, maybe it's the interwar years between World War I and II, and I just want to really understand this 20-year period and realize how complex it was, and how filled it was with things where the quote-unquote good guys weren't so good and the bad guys weren't so bad, and it reduces our trap to think of everything in black and whites,
mm-hmm.
good and bad, ones and zeros, stand-up ground fighting, old school, new school. It's a way to break out of that Hegelian, the Hegelian dialect mode. Most people don't really understand. That's kind of my route. And, even though I'm old or older, I feel like I have the enthusiasm of a kid with so many areas in my life that I just love doing.
Man, that's awesome, because that keeps it that keeps the vitality and the vibrancy for life going, right? So then your age is a number. I mean, obviously things do change as you age, but they
Yes.
don't have to change to the point that they do. We get conditioned on how to age, right? We look around and see all these examples of everybody on 10 medications and, not being able to exercise or barely walk, and
Yep.
that can really be a mental conditioning if we don't.
It can.
Yeah, so I love
Absolutely.
hearing examples like you're saying, as well as seeing examples of people as they're progressing in years, being vibrant, doing their thing, and loving life. So that's great to hear. I love how you said, I don't know exactly if this was the way, but active attempt to be humbly aware. I think you said it like that. That's really cool. I
Yeah,
love that.
and I mean, it definitely takes a conscious action
Right.
to keep yourself humble, right? I mean, it's not our human default is to do a quick assessment, make an opinion, and then find the things that help support our opinion.
Yes.
And that is like for the 10,000 years of civilized human history. That's why it's taken us 10,000 years to get to where we're at, because it predisposes one to not learn very much and not learn very fast.
Right.
And
there was a reason for that, right? I mean, it served us at one point. We have to make a quick decision.
Yes.
We don't have time to sit around and analyze it if our being is at stake. But go ahead.
Exactly. And we get this wonderful thing in this modern life where not only are our lives extended through modern medical science, we have literally so much information at our fingertips. And even pre-internet, there was libraries and colleges and universities filled with knowledge. There are more books published a year than any one person could read in their entire lifetime. There's just such a wealth of information out there. Sadly, because of the internet, we're also in a period of misinformation, but that just requires, which is also interesting, right? I'm always amazed at how talented misinformation is these days. The flat Earth, as an example. I mean, if you had little to no scientific background and you watch one of these things, you could understand why 2,000-3,000 years ago, a lot of the smartest humans believed the Earth was flat.
Right.
By the reasoning, through logical reasoning, you can draw that conclusion. And so it takes that open-mindedness to not only advance your own self, but hopefully be a participant in the advancement of all human culture, right? And so I try to think of myself in this internet age that if in 100 years the technology is such that you could basically reproduce me and go through anything I've ever written or podcast or whatever and find exactly who I am, I don't want to be an ignorant 21st century human, but I want to be as forward. I'm not going to use the word progressive because that all now means left leaning, but I want to be as forward thinking as I can.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It makes sense. It makes perfect sense. And I I try to be the same way. I try to discern the information and weigh it. It can be confusing these days because of misinformation, but at the same time, I really hate. First of all, I love the humbleness I'm speaking of saying, thinking I don't know everything. Let me really kind of investigate this. But I don't like the other side of that, which is attempts at, what's the word I'm looking for? Not regulating, but suppressing
suppressing information.
Yes, suppressing information or another side's view, and whatever side you are on politically, that doesn't matter to me. But the point is, there needs to be.
And that is, like philosophically, that is such a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
The topic of free speech, information, and in America, of course, most people don't. Most of us are not lawyers. Most of us don't understand law, and very few of us even understand what the First Amendment means and the originality of all that. But regardless, we all have a sense that the right to speak what you want seems pretty sound. Right. But then, like, we get into, could I scream a gun in an airport?
Sure.
And there's always, like, nothing's ever 100%
right. Absolutely
packed down. And in this age where big technology largely has as much or sometimes even more power than the governments, we are in a strange state now. That the closest we ever had to this was the 1930s, where the radio was suddenly, like, in 1923, like, what, 1 in 100 homes had a radio or whatever it was. By 1933, 1 in 6 homes have it, right? It became this, and the newspaper and the mass printing became these vehicles to both inform everybody and also spread misinformation at such a rapid rate that humans, the quote-unquote masses, and I'm not saying this like I'm above the masses, sometimes we're all the masses, cannot keep up. Because, you know, the old Winston Churchill or Mark Twain quote, you know, a lie can go halfway around the world before the truth has laced up a single boot. It's just, and that's kind of this age in which we are in. And it is just, we are in, as the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times, as their response to disaster. Like that's where we are, in some interesting times.
Yes, we are. And I acknowledge what you said about, you know, nothing's absolute. You can't say, you know, gun in an airport or examples like that. There's always things like that, but it, you know, and there were, way back when you said, like in the 30s, only very limited sources of information.
Right.
So they had a lot of power. But as it evolved, and say you went through the 1900s and the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and massive amount of books that are written and things like that. So, for example, you get someone who writes, a very learned, perhaps doctor or nutritionist, PhD, who writes a nutrition book, and they have one stance. And then someone equally as learned and educated can say the exact opposite.
Yes.
And the thing is, they can both be right, because for some, this approach may work, for others this way. So they can discuss, and the beauty of it is that open discussion and dialogue, and we can listen to it and say, which one makes more sense to me, you know, especially if they're both coming from some scientific, you know, reasoning as well.
Yeah.
But what's concerning is when one view or narrative is considered the right one now, and the attempts to suppress the other, because I'm a firm believer we should be able to be talking about differences and different philosophies, viewpoints, and talk about it. You know, that's healthy. Like,
here's an example of like what I see happening all of the time. So I've been doing the Jiu Jitsu for a long time, and even you could find some guy on the internet who's pretty smart, who could learn the lingo, take a few classes, and could present themselves as an expert in this, and be more articulate in being that expert. And if they're masters of propaganda, they would look like they know more than me.
Right.
They could correct me at the few areas where I'm wrong, and then suddenly they're more respected. Like, although it has been 30 years since I've had my last science class, or 25, I've had anatomy, physiology, inorganic chemistry, organic chem, microbiology, pathophysiology. I mean, all years ago. And I know just enough to know how little I know. But I also know just enough to pretty quickly detect somebody espousing knowledge that knows nothing.
Yes.
And I see a lot of them are very good at manipulating the truth. And people say, we all need to do our own research. But when we research, what we're doing it is on the backs of people who have researched before us. So you fall down the philosophical rabbit hole of asking what even is knowledge.
Right.
Like it's too complex to say knowledge is true and disinformation is false. We're already at a place where what is knowledge and what makes something true? And is truth relative or is it concrete? Is it subjective in some areas and objectively true in other areas? It's such a rabbit hole.
It is.
And the scientific method, which was probably the greatest evolved concept in the 100 years of the age of enlightenment, still going on, is this method of inquiry, which allows us to remain open-minded and humble, but not so open-minded the wind blows through our head.
Right, perfectly said.
Yep, and I just think that we're in an age where the internet can make you feel really smart really fast.
Right.
Really fast. Like, again, I could be a white belt who could obsess for a week, and if you asked me, I could sound like an expert in Jiu Jitsu pretty easily.
It's true.
And that's what I see people do with everything all the time. One of my favorite books of 2015 was The Death of Expertise, written by Tom Nichols, where, like, initially noticing in the early internet days how suddenly everybody through WebMD on the internet started telling the doctors what they needed instead of going and saying, I'm presenting these, what do I need, doc?
Right.
It was like, the doc, I've looked it up, I know what I have, here's what I need. And there was a phenomenon, a poll went around regarding the Iraq War, and they found that the more firm one's opinion, whether they were for the war or against, the least likely that they were to even point out Iraq on a map.
Wow.
So it's almost
That's
like
amazing.
the more ignorant you are, the more firm you become in your opinion.
Yes. That's so true.
Which is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
Right.
And even that effect has gone viral to a point where the misinformed will use that as a counter weapon.
Right.
And it is just, to me, it's just, we are in such postmodern times.
Yes. It can be so chaotic and confusing because of that. And, I agree about the scientific method. And that's always a way to keep evaluating, never to say, okay, that's it. We know for sure scientifically. And I think a lot of people miss that when they start talking about science. But, even things that, silly example. Well, one example is, medications that were considered the way to treat something way back, were given to, certain ones are given to pregnant moms that you never would now, or whatever. There's a lot of different examples, and that was the best truth at the time, or best science at the time. But now it's very different. Same with, in the 60s, chiropractic was considered terrible by regular allopathic physicians, and they tried to get them done away with, and now they're partnered up everywhere, and everybody accepts it. And I mean, things evolved.
And even that, in all of these things, there is a spectrum and a range of good, smart chiropractors and grifters.
Terrible. Yes, absolutely. Right? That is so true. So true.
Yeah, just bizarre times.
Bizarre times indeed. So I could talk about this kind of stuff for forever with you, but we get back to jiu-jitsu just a little bit.
Get back, yes.
How would you say Jiu-Jitsu is different than other grappling arts. And follow up to that, if we could separate them or put them in there. How does the rule set determine or influence how an art or sport evolves?
Well, so based on my theory of threes in the triangle, right? And I've said on many a speech, because I give speeches, I'm blessed that people pay to hear me teach and talk. Environment is stronger than will. And to especially martial artists, we think we can outwill environments. And all martial art and combat sports are something that has adapted to survive in the environment in which it is in. So your IBJJF style game is a game that is perfectly adapted to fit within those man-made rules and natural aspects, like we all have 2 arms and 2 legs. Like, all of these are variables in which create an environment that we evolve into and adapt. And if you want to change your art, you don't change your willpower, you change the environment in which you train, which includes the structural man-made rules of the game. So that's why I always say you think street, because you can't practically train street fights all the time. It's impractical. But you can think street while you are training within some man-made rules of the game, like, I won't gouge your eyes out, I won't rip out your throat, but we are going to train in such a way that if we did add these grabs and strikes, the martial art would still be effective.
Yes.
And that is that's been my philosophy for 20 years, and that's kind of my approach. So, like, too many times, like, I remember like 10 years back on the internet when everybody was arguing gi or no gi, and one of my lines is always, to gi or not to gi is a bad question. It's ridiculous. Yes. It's almost like saying, is air more important or water, or like whatever. They're both important. Right. They both have aspects that assist in the other one. No gi is slippery and fast. You have to have impeccably good timing. Gi is sticky and slow. You have to have really good tactical techniques. And they both help the other one. I used to be able to, like, I could almost instantly feel if I slapped hands with a guy who's no gi only, I could tell whether they wore a gi or not by their style. Because they wouldn't have pressure, they wouldn't be sticky, and they would emphasize the moves that go into shorter algorithmic patterns. Whereas the gi is a little more complex. I often say, like, the gi grappling is like a calculus, but you have more time in a calculator. No gi is like simple algebra and arithmetic without a calculator and faster time. So each of them have a skill that the other one can benefit from.
Yes, I always find it really fascinating, and sounds like you do too, when you talk about environment and how that shapes a culture, including martial arts. You know, if you're a culture that's by the sea, you know, you tend up eating things that reflect that. And you're farming, you know, all these things are related to where your culture is, right? In respect to the environment. And even martial arts, you know, the ones that had wide open spaces you would find ones that did like the high flying kicks because they would kick people off horses, and the ones that were more in the back alleys and the cities that had narrow streets would have a lot more tight kind of things like Wing Chun and things like that. So I always find it interesting to kind of, when you look at how different arts evolved, kind of where they came from and how they were shaped by their environment. So that's really cool.
Yes. And like, as an amateur anthropologist, I've always just been absolutely fascinated about, like, I'm more interested in cultural anthropology. it's fascinating how much a culture or a subculture can affect the group and the outcome of something like a martial art or music. Like a perfect example is music. It's like I often say, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, the Brazilian manifestation of this art was akin to the explosion of rock and roll. And no single person invented rock and roll. We don't say, oh, Elvis invented rock and roll or the Beatles invented. We all know it was a collection of individuals and an evolution that definitely hit a point where suddenly rock and roll had speciated away from jazz. It was definitely a different genre. And in the early days of jiu-jitsu, even though I'd done wrestling, I'd done some judo, I'd fought Muay Thai, I did all these things, you instantly would realize this is a new genre. This version of grappling art is new. And like rock and roll or any other music, we borrow from other music styles and other things, but we retain the rock and roll, right? And then sometimes it can evolve so far away that if you heard it alone, isolated, not in the context of its evolution, it would look like it wasn't rock and roll at all.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of where we get, which is why I say you really have to just absolutely broaden your brain and mind to, if you want the richest rewards of this art, you have to broaden your mind. It is just a necessary thing.
I agree. I love how you just described that. I picture modern day competition jiu-jitsu when you say what you just said, because there are a lot of merits in how it's evolved and in the sporting aspect, but also when you see someone and there's kind of some hilarious videos where the ref says go and then both people plop down their butt right at the same time, and it's like this doesn't even resemble what it was years ago as a fighting art.
Completely drifted away, and
yes.
And there certainly isn't anything necessarily wrong with that. A lot of people, I think people place too much value of right and wrong on these things. I mean, personally, I don't care. You can manifest your martial art any way you want.
Right.
I give you the freedom to do fake martial arts or whatever you want. I'm not a jiu-jitsu evangelist. I do it for my own growth, and I teach in a manner which thinks about the street, which has the practicality of sport, and always has the research of the artist. And that's kind of like that lets me kind of do everything without having to immerse myself and become whatever that is, right? I don't have to become the jiu-jitsu sport guy. I don't have to become the self-defense guy. I don't have to become the everything is utterly relaxed art guy either. I get to be and do all of them, right?
Yes. Well, and like you said, people tend to get very dogmatic on the kind or the aspect they're doing.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'm sport, and or I'm self-defense, and kind of look down on the other. But for like in the example I just said, I mean, it's laughable in some ways, but they can express it however they want, as long as you, to me, as long as you know where you're fitting in, street, sport, or art at that moment. And that doesn't mean you're locked into it and that's all you do. But if you're doing, plop to the butt and you're just looking for leg lock or whatever, just know that's that may not be the best thing for the street. You may just be in your art. You may just be trying to have fun, innovate, or whatever, and that's fine. But I guess I'm trying to say don't be deceived if you're in one and that it's the best thing for the other. You know what I mean?
Yep. I 100%. I know exactly what you mean.
All right. And with that, I do that. If I'm doing kind of a sport of open guard, I'm very aware that, okay, this is not street, or this is not what I would do in a street encounter, but I'm just having fun exploring right now. So
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think for all of us, when we're young, winning becomes is far more important than, at least now at my old age. Like now, I only roll competitively against occasionally with my peers, fellow older guys, fellow black belts. I don't waste my energy on giving my A game to some 25-year-old blue belt. It's just it's not worth the risk of injury just to prove I can beat him.
right.
And it enables me to train and practice in a way where I'm forcing myself to not use any athletics. So I have to really come up with a jiu-jitsu answer to this 25-year-old CrossFit blue belt.
Yes.
And it really does, it expands my game.
I love it. And I think that's the best approach by far, as we do continue to get along in years, and probably the best approach in general, but we tend to appreciate that more as we get older, I believe.
Yeah. As I've aged, I live in Redondo Beach. I've always kind of on and off wanted a boat. And of course, any listener out there who's owned a boat, I owned one briefly ages ago. A boat is a hole in the water to throw money into. And unless you're really into boats, you should not get a boat. And I know intellectually that I'm not really that into boats, but I kind of want a boat. It's just this weird thing where I like just being out there on the open water. What I realized most of all, I love being in other people's boats.
Right.
When it's your own, you suddenly have to, maintenance is always a concern, right?
Yes.
And they say the two happiest times of a boat owner's life is the day they bought the boat and the day they sell it.
That's hilarious and so true.
Hilarious. Yep.
It's so true. But see, when you recognize what you really liked and craved was being on a boat, not necessarily on. And I've seen people do this with owning jiu-jitsu academies.
Yes.
They love to train, so hey, I'm supposed to be instructor. I'm supposed to own a school. They get on there and realize, oh, this is work. This is a business. It's not just training all the time.
To own a school. Yeah. I've seen that happen so many times. I remember going through a phase. I was in Europe on one of my trips. I've been blessed where I get to travel 2 to 3 times a month all over America and 2 to 3 times all over the world to teach and see the world. And I was in a museum in Europe and realized that I loved this stuff as much or more than I would if I owned it. That it was absolutely fine that it was in a museum. Like, I don't have to own that 1963 Lincoln to love it. I can love it being in a museum and don't have to own it, or whatever it is. And it is such a freedom to be able to let go of material attachment, to be able to appreciate something without ownership.
That's great, man.
And like so as I've aged, that's kind of how I view the jiu-jitsu. I don't have to own being able to invert my body anymore. I can still enjoy the art, watching my blue belts invert and going, yep, you got it. That's where you invert.
Right. And again, I think that comes with maturity. Whether you're talking about jiu-jitsu or like you said, having something in a museum, you don't feel like you have to own it, but you can you can appreciate it from where you are, which is cool.
I just wish I'd learned all this stuff 10 years earlier. I always feel like I learned these valuable, wise lessons of jiu-jitsu and life 10 years after I should have learned it.
Yes, I can relate to that because, man, and you know what? This I don't want to get off too much on this, but I was talking to someone recently about this society anymore doesn't look up to the older population as
Very true.
value and the elders of the tribe, so to speak. And because, like you just said, it took a long time and a lot of years to learn this, and now you have that knowledge. But so many young people were like, they're just old, or you don't know enough about. You don't know much about technology, so how could you be useful? So.
I also think that because of the way pop culture works and the society of the spectacle, the people that we elevate who are old are the worst examples of elders often.
Give me an example of that.
I don't want to scare you. One could say Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
Okay. Yeah, I got you.
Whichever side you're on.
Sure.
Or the aging rock star opinion who's closed-minded to anything new.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is.
True.
Like, wisdom does not necessarily come with old age.
That is true.
Experience does, but not necessarily wisdom. And
that's
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Because if you might take some aged rock star who has partied his butt off all his life,
and he's an idiot.
You're right, and yet that's so and so. He must know about life, as opposed to someone who partied their ass off when they're young, but later on decided, hey, you can't do this all your life. You're just going to kill yourself.
Yes,
so I threw that stuff off. He's much wiser, in my opinion, than the first guy who still doing as hard as he can, but. Just because he was well known, he must know what he's talking about.
100%, 100%, and that really is just like one of those things that makes you want to get back on the mat and keep training, right?
Exactly right. So let's go back, change gears. I know you literally could probably talk about this all day, but we don't have all day, unfortunately. But take me back to where it started for you in Jiu-Jitsu. I know you're part of the original Dirty Dozen, and what was it like back then when you started, and also who've been the biggest influences in your journey?
Well, I had started in Horion Gracie's garage. I was introduced to the jiu-jitsu by Mitch Yamashita, who passed away a few years back in COVID, and he was the Aikido club master guy who had just discovered jiu-jitsu in Orion's garage. And I saw him practicing mount escapes. I remember thinking, I didn't realize there was a ground component to Aikido. Asked him about it. Said, I don't think that'll work. He mounted me. Of course, like any wrestler, I turned over to escape, and I got choked. And just like, wow, I got to learn Aikido. And he said, well, this isn't Aikido. This is jiu-jitsu, and it's a special kind, and here's the guy's number, and it was Horion Gracie's number. And I ended up at Horion's quite quickly and was hooked instantly and knew that I had hit the gold mine. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, I knew, like, wow, I had hit the gold mine of martial arts. And I had been training all over. And, LA is the mecca of the arts. Everybody comes to LA. That's where people come to train, right? And whether you want to be a movie star or people just come but to LA. And so I could say that I was in right place, right time. And that's what gave me the opportunity and the gift to start this game earlier, long time before many others did, which meant I got to become a black belt far earlier than most. I mean, I was naturally talented, driven, but I was in the right place, right time. That, which is half of the game. Yeah.
And you were involved in like JKD and everything back then, right?
Yes. Yep. I was an avid JKD guy. I was in the peer group with Burton Richardson, Damon Kara, Eric Paulson, Chad Stahowski, who he had went on and made the John Wick movies. And I was in a good generation of guys. I went the reality martial arts way. A lot of the other guys went the movie martial arts way. And I'm envious of their success quite frequently, but when we roll on the mat, they're envious of my skills, right? So
Very good. Yeah, I thought, yeah, you might have been back around with Bert Richardson and Eric Paulson. Those two I thought might be
yep.
part of that group. Yeah, so who stands out as some of the biggest influences besides, I know you started with Horion. Who else helped you in
Obviously,
your journey?
all of the Machado brothers. Hoist Gracie was my first instructor. Um, Hegan was my second instructor. Rickson was my third, and then has returned to being my primary coach now. But all of them, I've gained knowledge for whatever at that time I needed from all of them, right? And Hegan was like, because I was what I was lucky enough to be the guy who lived so close to Hegan that when he would have a private scheduled, he would call me in to be the helper. I didn't have
Nice.
a lot of money, but I was in a college at the time and I had time. And so I got, in essence, free privates for like 2 years.
Man, you can't beat that at all.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. And
Wow.
so it was, for me, it's all been a glorious adventure and gift.
Yes.
And this weekend I'll be in Michigan. I'm teaching at 2 schools. I think Magic is one of them. One of my black belts, Linsomer's got a crop of tough guys. And I'm not sure what the other school is I'm at. And yeah, I get to go around and be Johnny Jiu Jitsu seed and spread the knowledge. And
what could be better?
What could be better? Yep. And I live right near the Henner and Huron's big place. And so when the guys come in from all over the world to train, a lot of them come over to my garage and do privates with me too. And yeah, I mean, my life's blessed, completely charmed.
Cool.
Yep.
Very cool. Yeah, I'd been out to their place that they were at previously, and then the newer place as well. Very nice. But next time I go out there, next time I go out there to visit, I'll definitely come say hello at your garage.
You have to.
Definitely have to.
Stop in. Yep. Anyone out there, you can always contact me through combatbase.com. And when you're in the LA area, come look me up.
Absolutely. And listen, before we start bringing it to a close, you mentioned your wife before, Melissa.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how you guys met. And I know she seems like a very funny and interesting person. I have watched a few videos that I really liked that she did. So tell us a little bit about you guys, how you hooked up, and what she means in your life.
Well, the short version of it is I had just gotten out of a 4-year relationship that broke my heart. I was in a relationship with a woman that we weren't good for each other. She had no interest in me wanting to go run off and train jiu-jitsu. It was that constant, what, you're going out to train again? Didn't you do that last night? It's like, that's kind of what I do. You know, I'm not someone who sits around at night and eats and watches the TV. I'm someone, nights is when I go train. And that relationship was pulling me away from the jiu-jitsu a lot. And I kind of made up my mind that there was an ideal out there, woman, of what I was after. And I was talking with a friend, and he's like, I know that girl. I remember specifically saying, I want her to be brown-skinned, petite. I described how she looks, but she has to have a college degree. She has to have this. And he goes, I know that girl. And I'm like, what? No, you don't. And I lured Melissa in with my dog, because whoever I had to like dogs, because the relationship I was in before wasn't a real dog person. And I knew by the date where I was showing her mounted arm bars that she likes this relationship will work. And
if she likes that, she likes jiu-jitsu and dogs, man, there you go.
Yep. Exactly.
Right.
This is going to work. And I mean, I'm not saying that we've had a perfect relationship. We've certainly had our squabbles. We're both stubborn. We're both have fragile egos in certain areas and stronger egos than the normal person in other areas. And we certainly conflict. But yeah, and there was a point where she's 12 years younger than me, 13. I had groomed her to world-class level where her peer group, Mackenzie Dern and the other ones, she would hold her own with them, and then, got injured, pregnant, and you're quickly out of that window of adult level comp zone. And then she's in the journey of finding the art for the art's sake and learning how, by watching my mistakes and my adjustments, how to do this with grace and pleasure when you age. And that's the key. If you find yourself leaving the mat and you didn't have fun, you're doing something wrong. Whether it's your mental approach, your technical approach, you're not doing something right if you're leaving the mat unhappy. And that's kind of the gauge, right? Is when you leave for the mat, I don't want to be so exhausted and injured, even if I enjoyed being there, that the rest of the day I'm miserable. That's even not right? So I gauge how my mat time was when I'm off of the mat. Because when I'm on the mat, I want to be in the now. I don't want to be thinking about, I'm going to try to have a good time, because then you won't have a good time. I set my life up in a way that when I am on the mat, I'm training with a disposition that lets me walk off the mat satisfied.
Wow. I really, really love that. And that's exactly how I believe it should be, And I think that's the perfect philosophy.
I think so.
Anybody want to say a quick shout out to before we close?
I'm not gonna, because then I'll say a couple people's names and forget somebody else's.
Sure.
Go to combatbase.com and
Absolutely.
We have a great club. We're not really into all the exploitative hierarchies that a lot of other clubs have. Come join us.
Awesome. Well, man, it's been an absolute pleasure, and you're obviously impacting a lot of lives, so much respect to you, and long, healthy, happy life, my friend.
Well, thank you, sir.
All right. Really enjoyed that conversation with Chris. What an interesting guy he is. All right, this episode is brought to you by Breathing for BJJ. And Breathing for BJJ is a 31-day online video program that I spent 2 years in developing, and it's designed to transform your jiu-jitsu experience. There's nothing more important than your breathing. It makes a profound difference in your jiu-jitsu experience. Optimizing your breathing takes your jiu-jitsu experience to a whole new level and has a huge impact on your performance. Learning to regulate your breathing can completely transform your jiu-jitsu experience. Being able to slow your breathing down when you need to, create energy when needed, breathe when in uncomfortable positions and situations, and to find the calm within the chaos are skills you need to master to create and achieve the optimal jiu-jitsu experience. This program uses a biomechanical approach to actually target and strengthen your specific breathing muscles, creating efficiency and effectiveness in your functional capacity to breathe. It's time to make breathing the foundation of your BJJ. And you can find out more at www.breathingforbjj.com. Next up is the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment.
that nothing in life is worthwhile unless you take risks. Nothing. Nelson Mandela said, there is no passion to be found playing small and settling for a life that's less than the one you're capable of living. Without consistency, you'll never finish. So do what you feel passionate about. Take chances. Don't be afraid to fail. There's an old IQ test, was 9 dots, and you had to draw 5 lines with a pencil within these 9 dots without lifting the pencil. The only way to do it was to go outside the box. Don't be afraid to think outside the box. Don't be afraid to fail big, to dream big. But remember, dreams without goals are just dreams. Thomas Edison conducted 1,000 failed experiments. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Because the 1,001st was the light bulb. Fall forward. Every failed experiment is one step closer to success. You will fail at some point in your life. Accept it. You will lose. You will embarrass yourself. You will suck at something. There's no doubt about it. I didn't get the job. I didn't quit. I didn't fall back. But I continued to fail and fail and fail. But it didn't matter, because you know what? There's an old saying, you hang around the barbershop long enough, sooner or later you're going to get a haircut. But do you have the guts to fail? If you don't fail, you're not even trying. Never be discouraged. Never hold back. Give everything you got. And when you fall throughout life, remember this: fall forward.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the show. As always, I thank you for listening. Hope you're enjoying the show. Please like and follow us on social media and help us spread the word by reposting our posts and telling others about the show. You can leave comments on the website at www.GracieJujitsuRocks.com. You can also go to iTunes and leave comments, as well as rate the show, and we would appreciate a 5-star rating, which helps us with our standing in iTunes. You can also leave comments on our YouTube channel. If you have suggestions for the show, please don't hesitate to give those. We always like feedback and suggestions. Okay, that's going to do it. So until next time, this is Marty Josie, and I'll see you on the mat.